Hey everyone, and welcome. So today we're going to get into a really fascinating topic, postmodern music. And right off the bat you should know this isn't really about a specific sound or a style. Nope. It's much more of an attitude.
Okay, so let me start by asking you this. What do music samples and internet memes have in common? Think about it. They both grab something that already exists, right? Then they twist it, put it in a totally new context, and give it a whole new meaning. Just keep that idea in your back pocket because it is the absolute key to understanding everything we're about to talk about.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the basic idea of musical quotation, and then we'll get into the rebellious attitude behind it all. We'll look at how composers created these incredible musical collages, we'll uncover the secret messages of a composer who was basically postmodern before it was cool, and finally we'll ask what does it all mean when suddenly everything is available.
All right, let's dive in with the core technique that really got this whole thing started, using the power of sounds you already know.
So the simplest way to think about this is a technique called quotation. It's kind of like when a hip-hop producer samples an old soul record for a brand new track. You're taking a piece of music that the audience might recognize, and you weave it into your own work. And why? Well, you can create a new layer of meaning, maybe a little bit of irony, or just this powerful wave of nostalgia.
But why did composers even start doing this? Well, it was a direct and honestly often very playful reaction against the super serious movement that came right before it, which was called modernism.
You see, at its heart, postmodernism isn't a rule book. It's really more of a creative mindset. It was composers looking at the entire history of music, from Bach to the Beatles, from high art to pop culture, and basically declaring that it's all valid, it's all usable, it's all available to play with.
And this table here, it really lays out the difference perfectly. You can just see the clash. Look at the relationship to past. Modernism was all about rejecting what came before, about making it new. Postmodernism, on the other hand, just embraced everything. And look at the shift in the goal. Modernists wanted progress and innovation. Postmodernists, they were interested in dialogue, commentary, and even just pleasure. It was a huge change in attitude.
And once you adopt that attitude, the old rules just get shattered. It became all about mixing high art with what some people would call lowbrow entertainment. It was about embracing contradictions. And this part is absolutely crucial. It was about believing that the real meaning of the music is ultimately created by you, the person who's listening.
Okay, so that's the attitude, but how did it actually translate into music? I mean, how did composers take this everything is available idea and actually turn it into sound?
Well, they developed this really powerful toolkit. Quotation, as we said, was just the beginning. Eclecticism meant you could freely mix styles. Polystylism took that a step further, where you deliberately crash totally different sounds right into each other. And collage? Well, collage is where things get really wild. You're layering everything on top of everything else to create this incredibly dense tapestry of sound.
And if you want to talk about collage, you have to talk about the Italian composer Luciano Berio. His 1968 masterpiece, Symphonia, is considered by so many people to be the single most important work of musical postmodernism. It's just a sonic monument to this whole idea of mixing and matching. And I absolutely love Berio's own description of his process here. He didn't see it as just copying stuff. For him, it was a voyage to the interior of another piece of music, just to see what he could find in there.
And this slide just brilliantly shows what he meant. He takes a piece by Gustav Mahler and uses it as his foundation, kind of like a river. And then, floating along on that river, you hear these fragments of Bach, Debussy, Ravel, Strauss, even modernist composers like Schoenberg, and spoken words from the writer Samuel Beckett. It's this dizzying, overwhelming, and totally unique experience.
Now, another key figure, the Russian composer Alfred Schnittke, had his own term for this, polystylism. And where Berio's collage can feel like this dreamy exploration, Schnittke's polystylism often feels more like a battle. Imagine hearing this beautiful, graceful melody that sounds like Vivaldi, and then suddenly it's just shattered by this harsh modern chord. That violent contrast, that feeling of musical ghosts all fighting for control, that's the essence of Schnittke.
But here's where our story takes a really fascinating twist. What if I told you that maybe the greatest pioneer of all these techniques was an American insurance salesman who was doing all of this decades before anyone even came up with the word postmodernism?
So who was this musical prophet, this guy who was quoting, layering, and mixing styles long before it ever became a movement?
Meet Charles Ives. He was working pretty much in isolation in the early 20th century, and he created music that was just unlike anything else on the planet.
And his raw material wasn't fancy European art music. It was the music he heard all around him, the hymns, the patriotic songs, and the popular tunes of small-town America.
So get this. In his monumental Fourth Symphony, Ives doesn't just borrow the melody from the hymn Watchman. He borrows its question. By using this tune, he is literally asking the orchestra and the audience, what are the signs of promise?
And then, Ives gives us the answer. It's almost hidden in the music. You can barely hear it, but there's this fragile little fragment of another hymn, Bethany. And in the context of that first hymn, this faint little melody becomes the glory-beaming star from the lyrics. It's a symbol of hope.
So what this shows us is that for Ives, quotation was like a secret language. To really get his music, you kind of have to be a detective, uncovering these hidden dialogues that he created. It's this incredibly rich web of meaning hidden just beneath the surface.
So let's zoom back out. Where does all of this leave us? What's the ultimate legacy of this whole postmodern attitude?
Well, the most profound legacy is actually pretty simple. It tore down the walls. After postmodernism, those old barriers separating serious classical music from fun, popular music, high art from low art, they just couldn't stand anymore. Everything became part of the same giant creative toolbox.
And you know, this wasn't just a musical thing. It reflected a huge change in philosophy. It was tied to what the philosopher Lyotard called an incredulity toward meta-narratives. And what that really means, in plain English, is a deep skepticism towards any grand story about progress. This idea that art is on some inevitable march towards a single ultimate truth. Instead, there were many truths, many paths, and many histories to draw from. Which leaves us with one final and kind of provocative question. In a world where quotation is celebrated, where collage is a primary technique, and where the entire history of music is basically a toolbox available to anyone, what does it really mean to be original? That's something to think about the next time you hear a familiar sample in a new song. Thanks for watching.